the idea of downplaying, especially the experience of the victims, was not necessarily exclusive of historians working on German history. In fact, the author of the most important work, in my opinion, still is on the history of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, who authored this magnum opus, The Destruction of the European Jews, downplayed the experience of the victims. He believed, actually was Jewish, he had many members of his family died in the Holocaust, but he thought that somehow by studying the perpetrators one could be more objective, and somehow victims in their testimonies were, he said, more biased. I mean, of course, this is extremely problematic. In fact, when I was a graduate student, I wrote an article criticizing this dimension, which of course he didn't like. But again, this happens and again, and yet things have changed also in the field of Holocaust studies and Jewish studies and German history. I will just mention that there is way more interest in the last, let's say, I will say 2 decades on comparative genocide, which again, it doesn't mean equalizing everything, but seeing the connections, because there are many connections. You have this genocide, you have this other, and there are many connections. And sometimes these connections are actually historical, such as, for example, the experience of the Herero genocide by the Germans in Namibia. This happened sometime before the Nazis came to power, but also acted as a precedent to this. And here I would like to mention the work of historian Jürgen Siebener and Isabel Hall, for example, in which they analyze the connections, but also at some point they say, okay, but there are limits to this. Now, when I started teaching at the New School in New York, this was in 2006, I was asked by the dean at the time of the college to teach a history of the Holocaust. And I included, it started with Namibia. And some people were shocked, but this is part of this history, and it doesn't mean that it's the same. It means that it's a precedent. And then we have now studies on issues related to trauma, history of sexuality, global history. Here I would like to mention the work of Dirk Moses, Amos Goldberg, Simon Levi-Sulam, Dan Stone, Jennifer Evans, and of course, many of us are going back to the work of Hannah Arendt, who signaled these connections, sometimes in problematic ways, but she was not exclusively interested in, this event as not connected to anything else. In my own work, and I mentioned this in passing, I was, of course, dealing with this issue in terms of the history of populism, but then I have another book which I wrote on the Argentine Dirty War. I was a young kid at that time, and I was concerned about anti-Semitism and the particular dimension, which I find it difficult to explain, that Jews were and are now in Argentina, my community, I'm Jewish and Argentine as well, or I'm an Argentine Jew, they were less and are less than 1% of the population, and between 10 and 15% of people killed by the Argentine dictatorship in the 70s were Jewish. So I wanted to know, why is this the case? I mean, what is the place of this? And one particular dimension, which is not the only one, is what I call these trans-historical histories of traumatic encounters, trans-historical histories of trauma. Because one weird dimension, to use another word, which is not that great but explains the kind of uncanny dimension of these events, is that Jewish victims were tortured in Argentine concentration camps by people that told them that they were doing what Hitler did in Auschwitz or or in other places. So in fact, this was not the same. These were not these were two histories, two contexts, and two different continents. And yet, these histories were collapsed into what I call this kind of historical memories of perpetrators, that they are inspired by, by the Nazis, for example, by not being exactly what the Nazis did, but sometimes these events also are inspiration or provide an inspiration for perpetrators out there. And these connections we need to study as well. Sometimes also the Nazis themselves established these connections. We should remember that, Eichmann, when he was, who was living in my country, in Argentina, he was asked if he wanted to say something before his execution in Israel. And Hannah Arendt said, well, he chose to be a cliché, because he said, yes, my last words, and he said, I don't remember the order, but he said, long live Austria, Argentina, and Germany. And so my point is that he meant it. He saw connections between the Argentine fascist experiences and the experience he had lived and authored, some years before. And I think there is a movie that really gets, many dimensions of this, about the Eichmann kidnapping. It's a really good movie. In the Q&A, I can explain also some dimensions of it because, anyway, I could. So now I would like to turn to the victims. And in a way, they provide us with another reason why we should focus on these connections between fascism and the Holocaust. Because the distinctions, in fact, started to happen more and more after 1945 for reasons which were not connected to the context of fascism at the time. What I mean by this is that in so many testimonies from the period, from Jewish victims, we see that they are talking about Nazis and fascism as if these are the same thing. Because they understood Nazism to be a case, a radical example of a broader fascist situation. But this is not, or this should not be shocking. I mean, if people were in Romania or Hungary, they will see they are local fascists and also they will know the Nazis. And in fact, this is, for example, we can see this in the writings of Chaim Kaplan in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's talking about the Nazis, he's talking about fascism in a more global way. Another key victim, in terms of what he left us, which is this very important work to understand what happened, Jean Amery, he said, he wrote about real fascism and singular Nazism. Alexa. And finally, I would like to, perhaps even I could read a little bit, if, from Primo Levi, because Primo Levi, this survivor of the Holocaust that left us with this incredible work of interpretation. Is a memory, yes, but he's also allowing us to understand what happened. It's like, for us historians, it's an incredible situation to have the privilege of such a thinker, in a way trying to analyze things as they happen in ways that we cannot, for sure. And he said, Nazism was the German version of fascism. And he went even, he even said that, and I read, the black shirts, the fascists, had not just killed Turin's trade unionists, communists and socialists. First, they made them drink half a kilo of castor oil. In this way, a man is reduced to tatters, is no longer human. So he sees this dehumanization, which is central to every fascist project, political project, as happening in 1922 in Italy. So he sees these connections, and he says, actually, he says, there is a direct connection between the Turin massacres of 1922 and the entry ceremony in the Nazi camps, which he lived, by the way, I add, where they strip, destroy your personal photographs, shave your head, tattoo you on the arm. And he concluded, this was the demolition of man. And he's talking about the Holocaust, but he goes on, this is fascism. And I think we need to return to these words in order to further analyze them. And I would like now to finish with a question from my grandfather, which is, of course, in terms of the history of Judaism, is a more, many times millenary question. And with my grandfather, Mauricio Meyer, he always asked me, because he knew, by the end of his life that I was very interested in this stuff, and I was trying to study it, to analyze it. And different things that I was telling him, he will always ask, and is it good for the Jews? And I think this question is really, really important, because what it means is not a narcissistic question. It means, are we in danger? And what it means is, are minorities and pluralism in danger? And this is the question. This is the question. We are a minority. Are we in danger? Meaning, is this against, for example, constitutional democracy? This is the question. As simple as it sounds, this is the question. It was the same question in the Middle Ages, which is, are they coming for us? Are we living times of peace? Are we living times of more equality? Or are we living, the Middle Age version of authoritarianism? And I think we should continue to ask this question. And this is a question that is I think, central to us today. Now, my own personal answer to this question is that never, from the perspective of Judaism, that whenever you have people combining these four pillars of fascism that I mentioned before, violence and the militarization of politics, fascist lies and propaganda, dictatorship or dictatorial attempts through coup d'etats. And this politics of xenophobia, it was never good for the Jews or other minorities. Thank you.
Is fascism a necessary condition for genocide? So put differently, even if every fascist state was not genocidal, do you need fascism to end up with genocide?
I mean, that's an interesting question, because of course we have genocide without fascism. I mean, so we have genocide without fascism, right? And yet, when fascism is in power, it becomes quite genocidal in most cases. I mean, or let's say, or engages in mass killings. So, I mean, the most famous cases of fascism in power, Germany, Italy, but also Spain, suffer, different forms of mass killings, including genocide. I mean, Italy, and this is interesting. I mean, I mentioned before this myth of Italy being different. And Italy, in fact, like in Northern Africa and in Ethiopia, engaged in genocidal policies, including using chemical weapons against their victims. But this is kind of or it used to be understudied. Now many people are working on this. So, I mean, let me put it this way. When you have a fascist regime, when you had a fascist regime, I'm talking about the past, genocide was always like a potential situation, and eventually became one. I mean, in Eastern Europe, what you had is, because fascism can come to power in three different ways, just to simplify it. Or let me rephrase more historically. Fascism came to power in three different ways: by destroying democracy from within to create the dictatorship from above, Italy and Germany; by civil war, coup d'etat and civil war, Spain; but also by Nazis occupying your country and putting fascists in charge. And that's what happened in so many European countries, and they all collaborated in the Holocaust in this kind of pan-European genocidal project. So, yeah, there is a connection there.
I think the next question is one that is important for all of us. Do you think fascism will rise in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years? I assume the person who asked the question is referring to the United States.
I mean, again, this returns us to the question of what is new and what is not. And I have been suggesting some of this in my previous two books, and I'm now writing this book, which is going to be entitled The Wannabe Fascist. People that are the wannabe fascists, people that aspire to fascism but are not there yet, and hopefully they will never be there. I mean, because this is another dimension of fascism, that it happens when we let them. That's important to remember. So they just don't win because, they are alone. They win when, society no longer cares about democracy much, when institutions of the state side with the wannabe fascist dictator rather than with the constitution, and so on and so forth. So you can basically say these people are close to fascism, that's what I say, but they are not there yet. Because think about Bolsonaro, just to be more diplomatic. Let's focus on Brazil for a second. Or think about Trump, it's the same. Yeah. They were very similar. I mean, I'm not that diplomatic in my books. I mean, Trump and Bolsonaro are all over the place here. So, think about the four dimensions, the four pillars of fascism. Lies, check. Violence and the militarization of politics is there. It's not necessarily as extreme as it was, but it's close. Lies there, yes. Xenophobia and politics of hatred, and is there. They used to. I mean, this is interesting that I call them populists. This new populism that kind of, let me put it this way, it kind of goes back to these elements that were rejected by earlier populists, people like Perón, as I mentioned before, because they go back. They no longer consider these things to be toxic. I mean, Perón would never have had a fascist anti-Semite for dinner, or at least not openly. Not openly like this. I mean, because that's a problem. Politically, it's a problem. You don't want to show that you are having dinner with Nazis. But now it's no longer the case. I mean, that, from Orban to Bolsonaro to, in Brazil, like I think it was the Secretary of Culture, he was plagiarizing a speech by Goebbels. He's talking, and some scholars said, wait, that's Goebbels was saying this. And then he said, oh, I found it in the internet. I didn't know it was Goebbels. Like, so the point is that, the last category, four pillars, right? The last one is dictatorship. That populism famously rejected dictatorship to engage in democracy. And whenever they lost, they didn't like the results, but they respected them. And I can tell you many cases, including a very authoritarian leader, Hugo Chavez, who, when he lost, he didn't like it. I mean, a reform that he wanted to do, and then he called for elections again. And so this is new. The fact that these populists, return to all these elements, but also do not recognize electoral results, and also at least some part of their constellation participate in coup d'etats. I mean, it's close enough that I call them wannabe fascists. But the question is, will they become fascists? I hope not, and we will not allow them. I mean, I hope we will not allow them. But the point is that once, the only way, in my opinion, to answer that question, like historically, is, okay, when finally you have a Bolsonaro or a Trump, let's say, as being the president without, or actually opposing electoral results, we call that dictatorship, permanent power without elections or without electoral results. So we were close. So let's put it this way. How close? It's a matter of debate, but we were close, and this is new. So this is the new, like the age of Trump and so on. Yes, this is new. Generally in the US, you don't have coup d'etats. We used to have a lot of them in my own country, in Argentina. But in the US, this is new stuff. And in my opinion, let me put it this way. Had they succeeded, Bolsonaro and Trump, we should talk about fascism, no longer populism. I'm still talking about populism because they are not there yet. I hope they are never there. But they return to key elements of fascism. I call them wannabe fascists. That's the title of my next book, which I have to finish, actually.
And 10 minutes.
Somebody else asked, and this is very fitting to what you were just talking about, might there be a possible fifth pillar? And this person is referring to the ties between corporations and the state. For example, during Nazi Germany, IG Farben and the Krupps.
There are many dimensions of fascism. Like in my book, I wanted to, to bring it down to four, because I think these are the, central. But in my book, I talk about different dimensions of fascism. And yet, I don't think one, in the 1930s, there was corporatism, this idea that corporations are central to the economy and politics. And in the 1970s, people, in my country that were close to fascism, they had none of that. So I don't think the economic dimension is the one that really cuts into what fascism is about. Because you can see certain, let's say, economic policies in the 1930s or 40s, and very different economic policies in the 1970s, people close to this. Now, if the question is about links with, links with capital, in that sense, or I don't think that is specific enough of fascism. There are many situations like that. So this of course returns to a famous definition of fascism by the Communist International. We said, well, what is fascism? But it's the last radical expression of capitalism, of financial capitalism. And I don't buy that because it's, many regimes can be that. It's not, you don't need to be fascist to identify with those kind of politics. And so it's not specific enough. But it's part of the explanation, of course.
Another question is, what is the role in fascism of a tax on labor, unions, communists, socialists?
That's a really interesting question, and I will like to focus on the way, a really great historian of fascism, which was the late Zev Sternhell, an Israeli historian, who said that, Sternhell said that what is central to fascism is that it incorporates slogans and ideas that come both from right and left in order to create an extreme right version of the right. But it's interesting because they borrow slogans and they empty them of meaning and they create something else. Let's not forget, this is another lie, that the Nazis called themselves National Socialist Party, and of socialism they have nothing. Nothing. It was at war. They hated socialism. Now, what Stengel says is that they took the idea of socialism, but replaced the idea of, let's say, of social inequality. They kind of replaced it with an idea of national inequality. So they used that kind of vocabulary to talk about nations which were proletarian and nations which were, plutocratic, so to speak. But in a way, they really didn't care about social inequality. So there is there is no social dimension there. I mean, but they use that. And from nationalism, of course, we know what they took. So Stengel said, I mean, in one of his famous books, Neither Right Nor Left, that it was a combination. It was a right-wing combination of elements that came from the left and elements that came from the right. But that doesn't mean that it was leftist. I mean, the left was the enemy. I mean, Mussolini, when he was, in his younger years, he was a leader in the Socialist Party. Once he became a fascist, one of his main aim was to, persecute socialists. He hated them. Anyway, so this is there are connections, but the connections are ones of hatred and rejection in that sense.
And that brings us to the final question. What is the primary message you want the audience to walk away with today?
Going back to, going back to these questions that we asked in the beginning, right? Like what's going on and what is new? That we should certainly separate the past from the present, but not so much, because we should be concerned about the present and the future in ways that were matters of concern to many people that then we read, Primo Levi, Hannah Arendt, and many others. So I think we cannot forget these histories, because sadly many of these histories are connected to our present and hopefully not to our futures, but that's our work, right? So basically, it's important that we should not forget, I don't think we should forget that fascism succeeded when society ignored the peril, when society, many members of society did not care about liberal democracy. And again, and this is important, when important dimensions of the state identify with the dictator. Anyway, so that's...
Thank you. Please join me all in thanking Federico